Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rafael Flores, Director of Narrative Strategy at Homegrown. Welcome. I see more people coming. Thank you, everyone. We're excited about hosting our first book club with Elliot Haspel, who has recently published his new book, Raising a Nation, which we also helped launching maybe a month ago or so. And yeah, we're excited about organizing this first book club to discuss the first part of the book. Um, just a little housekeeping. We are recording this event because we're planning to share it after with the ones here and with some people that have requested it. We are also going to have live interpretation to Spanish. And with that, let's just open the mic for our friend Diego, who's going to be interpreting, and he will give you a little bit of guidance on how to connect to this part of the or of our book club. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rafael. So I'll give the instructions in English and repeat them right after that in Spanish. Voy a comenzar en inglés y luego repito las instrucciones en español. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diego Pons. I'm here today with Community Language Cooperative, the CLC, and I'll be the simultaneous interpreter for today's meeting. So in a moment, once I give this instructions in both languages, the host of the meeting will activate the interpretation function. Once that happens, you're going to see a globe icon that's going to say interpretation that will appear there in the bottom right-hand corner of your computer screen. There on the toolbar, you'll see a globe icon that says interpretation. I will ask you to please select that globe icon once I'm finished. That says interpretation, and to please select your preferred language. If you're joining the meeting today on your cell phone or tablet, please look for the More button option or that three dots button option, which will appear in the corner of your device screen there on your cell phone or tablet, and that will allow you to find that interpretation globe icon this other way. So as always, if you are not fully bilingual, I strongly encourage you to select your preferred language so that you can listen to the interpretation, or meaning my voice, whenever someone speaks in the opposite language. If you are bilingual, you can just feel free to listen to everyone in the original language, which means my recommendation for you is if you are bilingual, don't select the language channel. That way you don't have to hear my voice as the interpreter, and you can just speak freely in whichever language you want at any moment without having to switch manually on your device between language channels. If you have any questions for me, you can let me know through the chat. And as always, just please remember to speak at a conversational pace like this. Just please make sure you don't pick up your reading speed. So thank you so much. Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Yo soy Diego Pons. Estoy aquí hoy con el CLC. Voy a ser el intérprete para la reunión de hoy. Vamos a tener interpretación simultánea, así que no va a haber ninguna pausa en el diálogo. En un momento se activa la interpretación. Cuando se active esa interpretación, usted va a poder ver un icono, un globo de la Tierra que va a aparecer ahí abajo en la derecha de su pantalla. Yo le pido que por favor elijan ese icono globo de la Tierra cuando aparezca en su pantalla y que por favor seleccionen su idioma preferido. Si hoy está asistiendo a la reunión en su celular o en su tableta, por favor busque la opción que dice More, M-O-R-E, o ese botón de tres puntos para que pueda elegir su idioma preferido de esa otra manera en unos dos dispositivos. Si usted no es completamente bilingüe, yo le aconsejo que por favor seleccione su idioma preferido para que pueda utilizar la interpretación cuando alguien está hablando en el otro idioma. Si usted sí es bilingüe, se puede sentir libre de escuchar a todos hoy en su idioma original. Y si tiene alguna pregunta para mí, el intérprete, me pueden dejar saber por el chat. Muchas gracias. So, ready to start?
Just before introducing officially Elliot, we are, as I said at the beginning, we are hosting our first book club. This means we're going to have more for us to discuss the full book with you. And with this, Elliot, welcome to your first book club.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you, Karen, Diego, and thank you everyone for being here. It's good to see some faces and names that I know, to meet some that I don't. Looking forward to this. A couple of things I'll say up front. This is my first time doing a virtual book club, so this will be a little bit of an experiment, and I hope you all will have us some grace as we try to make this work with, 30 plus people and a webinar format, and we can learn and iterate for the next one as well. I'll also say that I am on the back end of a cold, courtesy of my children. So if I at any point sound a little bit froggy, or if I'm go off camera for a second to sneeze, I also would ask for your patience in that good old winter germs. So, I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think if you want to introduce yourself briefly in the chat, just your name, where you're from, maybe the role that you have in the childcare sector, or if you're not, just your professional role, then we can get a sense of who everyone is and where everyone's at. You should be able to chat to everyone at this point. If that's not possible, do let us know. We can make sure that setting is set. So, in order to make this more interactive, my hope for this time together as we go through the first three cases that I wrote about in Raising a Nation is just to make this interactive through polls. Going to ask you to put a lot of things in the chat. If there are kind of questions for me that come up throughout this, you use the Q&A for that. And then at the end, I'm hoping to lay aside some time to answer some of those questions as well. So, welcome to those. I see people are introducing themselves in the chat. Please keep doing that. So I'm gonna start by launching a poll here, which is just asking you about like as you've gone through your career in the past, what arguments most often are you using right now when making the case for better investments in childcare? And there are more than just the options that are available, but I thought, given what we're discussing today, that would be a good place to start. So I'm going to launch this poll, take a minute here to answer it, and we can kind of ground on that. People another 10, 15 seconds here to answer that. Great. Cool. Cool. So as you can see, it really, and this is what I would answer as well. I think, certainly before I started doing this, sort of looking at this more deeply, is economic arguments and the child development arguments are the two pillars, I think, of how we tend to make the case, right? Make the case around this is good for parents being able to work, it's good for business productivity, and it's good for the development of children, who then sometimes ties into the economic arguments because they will become the workforce of tomorrow. And then, a solid number of us do about half of us make these community strengthening and family flourishing arguments. So I think that's a perfectly, reasonable place to start. So the first of the when I wrote, I guess to back up a little bit, because then we're going to go case by case for these first three cases. When I originally wrote Raising a Nation, it was out of a desire to broaden the narrative toolkit that we were working with, because I think those economic arguments and child development arguments are valid and useful, and they don't resonate with everyone. And we've become so reliant on those arguments in some ways that there are times I think we need to be making arguments that are more unexpected, that resonate with people's values and with their moral foundations that who don't resonate as much with the economic or the child development arguments. And so that was my entire framing behind even going through the book. So the first chapter is the solidarity case, right? And this is really talking about thinking about how childcare either does or does not bring parents together in terms of thinking if they can work together towards a common goal, or are they pitted against each other. So I have a discussion question around this, and I'm going to share my screen. This, because there's a history to how we got here to this place where in a lot of ways, childcare is not considered a piece of social infrastructure, but rather is considered a market good. So the first question is, what part, if any, of the history I went through, and there's a reason I put that at the chapter one, because I think it's important to understand how we got to where we are. What was surprising about it? What didn't you know before that maybe you learned, or what did you know that he kind of reinforced for you? And this is an important fact. So again, you put in the chat, what part of that history?
Elliot, just one small thing. I think people can actually raise their hands, and we can be able to open the mic individually if
Even
you
better.
would like to voice your response.
Yeah, that's a great point. So yes, if you want to share verbally, please raise your hand. We can bring you off. So, for instance, Kelly, if I could put you on the spot. Do you want to voice over maybe what you're talking about there? Allow to talk.
Yeah, hey Elliot. I was just reflecting. I've learned most of the history that you shared there, but the visual of people protesting for the need for childcare and support of families, you know, almost 100 years ago, and the fact that um, you know, not much has changed other than what they might have been wearing, uh, really hit home for me that we haven't made much progress despite how many people today know it's needed and know it's important. Um, that really hit home for me.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. I will say too, if anyone hasn't seen uh this article from 2019, Lydia Kilsing did a great job getting into the archives, finding a bunch of like contemporary photographs of the Lanham centers and of the protests that happened afterwards. So I think that's really good, just compelling way to look at it. And I think I appreciate you saying that, Kelly, about how, yes, we are many ways fighting battles we fought almost 100 years ago, which is a little bit depressing. But it's important to realize. What else stood out to anyone about the history of how we got to where we are? Again, you can either put it in the chat or you can raise your hand and we can allow you to talk. Going to give a little bit of awkward wait time. Yeah, Whitney, appreciate that. It's also saying that we created a national child code system for World War II. I do. I will tell you, I knew a lot about the Lanham Act centers. Like I knew they existed, and I knew that they went away, but it wasn't until I dug into kind of the battle over whether or not to continue them. Like you realize just how stark some of those mindsets were that led to their closure, and also how much that lit a spark in a lot of ways uh, you know, uh, under the parents and the women in particular who would then go on to try to lead that movement. Great. Jessica, I see you raising your hand, so let's let you talk.
Hi. So I feel like I knew a lot of this, but the one thing that I wasn't really sure about, and that your book really highlighted for me was, yeah, exactly. I just saw Tammy just pop that right in the chat, was Reagan's role, like the transition from Nixon to Reagan, and really how the woman's role in the workforce and the market playing into that, and how childcare really, and your highlighting of kinder care and how that transition from like I knew everything about like universal childcare and the Nixon veto and all that, but then how the hostile environment for childcare really arose in the 80s.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jessica. I think that's right. And is interesting. I think often Nixon gets rightfully the blame for the veto of the 71 Act, and he did. It was interesting to learn or to dig again into this idea that he entered office, Nixon did, actually talking a pretty good game about families. He was talking about a family assistance plan that would basically create guaranteed minimum income for families with dependent children, or he was talking about childcare. Like it really did, for all intents and purposes, look like we were going to end up with with a universal childcare system essentially, or some version of a publicly funded childcare system. And so yes, that moment, it's it's been said before that in some ways childcare is a victim of timing. If the Comprehensive Child Development Act had come up 5 years earlier, right, it probably passes and gets signed into law. Because if you think about, the mid 60s when you had Medicare and Medicaid and a bunch of other, programs coming into vogue, it just one of those vagaries of history that it landed at a bad time. It landed, a time when Nixon was very worried about his right flank. I think that part of the politics too, in a lot of ways. I didn't have as much space to get into this entirely in the book, but like a lot of ways, he vetoed it not even because it wasn't even about childcare. In some ways, to him, my understanding is a lot of it was just politics of him wanting to shore up his right flank. He was really worried about because he's paranoid. He was worried about getting a primary challenger in the 72 election from the right, and so I think again he had this act come up even earlier before he started engaging with China, before he was paranoid about showing up his right flank. Maybe he signs it. It's like all of these things like that could have caused it to get signed into law, and then they don't end up lining up, and then we're still dealing with the legacy of it. So.
Elliot, I would like to voice one of the messages that is written in Spanish here from
Please, yeah, I was
Karine.
about to ask you that
Yes,
actually.
and
Yes.
she's mentioning that nowadays we not only work with children, we also it is necessary for us to share and work on educational strategies and share them with families as well. So that's what she's mentioning in her message.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very valid point. And yes, please, anyone share if you all. I will say this too. I should say this up front. Like many of you are experts in your own rights, and obviously all of you are doing this work on the ground. So if there are resources, if there are things that you've done that you know about that you want to share with this group, please do feel free to put those in the chat. I'm sure people would appreciate that. Great. Britannia, go ahead.
Hi, Elliot. So nice to have received a copy of your book. I'm also under the weather. My twins are sick, so if I
It's the
don't
season.
sound coherent, it's the season. But I really enjoyed actually only cracking open the first chapter since then. But I really found it interesting about the linking of childcare and fast food, and just thinking through the commercialization of a very personal care service, and how that didn't always line up with how childcare was regulated. We saw you mentioned a little bit about private equity coming in on the early onset and building many of their large facilities along interstates, and how my lived experience as a family childcare provider, as well as a national movement leader for the childcare movement, I have really seen the importance of the center of the home, like making sure that home-based care and families are actually centered in the type of care that we get. And sometimes that over commercialization really makes it hard for providers to stay competitive enough to make ends meet. And here we are today with, a large set of women, and especially women of color, who have been the workforce behind the workforce, the labor, not having adequate support to run that kind of business model when it was really over hyper commercialized from the get-go, and how it made its headway after wars and things like that. So I found it very interesting that this was something that they were linking, the fast food, the Mickey
Yeah.
D's, and all of that to a business model that is very much the opposite. So thanks for making that parallel.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that comment. And you're right. The obviously for-profit childcare is center based almost entirely, and so it does stand in some ways in tension with family childcare and other types of provision. That article has always stood out to me as like the whole drive-in daycare piece is one of the most stark examples of just how what kind of a turn the childcare conversation took when we chose not to invest in it publicly. So Kelly, I see you raised your hand, so let's bring you on, and then I'm going to launch another poll, and then yeah, we'll keep talking.
Yeah, thanks, Elliot. I just wanted to kind of comment on, I love Dana Suskind's comment about like there's no AARP for parents. And it just really connected for me a little bit ago. I read this book called Seven Social Movements That Changed America by Linda Gordon. It's a fascinating read about just kind of grassroots activism across a lot of different movements, but she spends a lot of time talking about the Townsend movement that really was kind of the spark for um, kind of pensions and Social Security. But it was just beautifully told about how it was just so community led, though it was a nationwide movement, that people would join these like Townsend clubs and come together. And like it was very much almost like a Rotary or like Elks Club, but community led thing that really led to this kind of activism around, yeah, Social Security. And I just so badly wanted that for parents and for kind of family policies and childcare. So worth a read.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not familiar with that book. I'm writing it down, and I will hear from the library. Seven Social Movements That Changed America. Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. All right, so I'm going to launch the next poll, which is really asking sort of this framing question, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about why I think this is so important before we move on to talk about the community case. And I know this isn't actually a binary that we hear both sometimes, so this is more like what you most often hear talked about. Great. All right. I think the answer here will probably come as a galloping shock to no one. But overwhelmingly, people hear it talked about as an individual and private family issue and more than we hear it talked about as a shared societal responsibility. That is absolutely my experience as well. And there's scholarship to suggest that is indeed the case. I think it's actually really, really important. I think this right here is at the root of a lot of the challenges that we have in advocating for publicly funded and universal type of childcare system. I quote the sociologist Sandra Levitsky in the book talking about how that switch from seeing something as a private individual responsibility to seeing something as a shared social responsibility is often a prerequisite for political action. Because if you think something is only your problem and it's actually a failing, if you aren't able to make it work, then you are unlikely to want to come out into the light and say, hey, this is something that I want to work with a bunch of other people and want to go about and do it. And so I appreciate the work of, you know, Britannia and many others here who do this advocacy work. You are willing to step up, and as part of this is needs to be us saying this is more than just an individual family responsibility. That message has not sunk deep yet, and it's really really important. Another example that I've come across, there's a political scientist, Elaine Kamarck, who has written this book called How Change Happens, and she talks about the example like this of smoking, which is an interesting one, right? And that for the first 150 years of, 200 years of American history, smoking was considered an individual choice. Some people might have frowned upon it as like a bad habit, but like no one thought it was something that should be particularly regulated, other than maybe not letting little kids do it. But that it was very intentional work that was done in the movement starting in the 60s, and then when the flight attendants started getting involved in the 70s, and it's all of this work that was done to understand secondhand smoke, to understand the effect it's having on other people beyond just the individual to who's choosing to smoke or not smoke, to the point that you have, by the 80s, the first sort of restrictions being passed, and now, right, smoking is effectively banned in every indoor public space and every indoor workplace, and really no one questions it. Like, I think it would be pretty astounding to, I should ask this to my own daughters this, but be astounding to kids this day, to the fact that you used to be sitting on an airplane and people would just be smoking like cigarettes all around you. So I do think that's a really important point. All right, so I'm gonna catch up on the chat here real quick before we move to the next one. Yep. Yeah, lots of good thoughts here in the chat. I think we can definitely talk about the connection around labor and sort of the unskilled labor and why is it so devalued. I will say, as a general comment there, it is interesting to note that is, I think, more than just childcare. I think that is care writ large that has been devalued, and that has also, not unsurprisingly, falls on the shoulders of women and women of color disproportionately. It is. I sometimes think it's interesting to look at elder care when I do my research, because you lose the same kind of social disdain over mothers of young children working, because that's not sort of the deal when you're talking about a parent, someone caring for an aging parent or an elderly person. But you still see like home health care aides are incredibly poorly paid, right? Like their elder care continues to be devalued as well. We expect a lot of unpaid or underpaid care to be given by women. And so in some ways, I also think there's a through line here of the way that the free market family that I talk about, that Maxine Eichner writes about, is not just happening for parents of young children. I think it's important to say that. We're going to need a wholesale reinvention, in my opinion, of how America thinks about care writ large. Cool. So I want to move us to the community case now. And this is where we're talking about all the ways in which childcare impacts entire communities and impacts those that beyond just the people who have young children and the young children themselves. So I'm going to reshare my screen. Well, actually, first I'm going to ask a poll question. Oh, poll time. Okay, so this poll is asking, I talk about a couple of different categories of community impact in that chapter. And I'm curious which ones were most compelling, which one was the most compelling to you. Again, multiple ones of them may have been compelling, but if you had to choose one that you're like, oh, that argument really, like that, case really worked for me. Focus on a couple seconds here. Do this. Great. So we can see the folks who answered, that building social cohesion, helping to kind of strengthen communities writ large, seems to have been a compelling message. And then a third of you said that it's compelling to you to keep families rooted where they live. and then some saying the public health and safety argument, and then strengthening faith communities didn't pop as the most compelling. Again, it could. This is only asking you to choose one. It's not saying it wasn't compelling at all. I think that's really interesting, and I think this is an important thing to think about in your own context, right? So, for example, like those of you who may live in, I'm going to ask sort of a discussion question in a minute to get at this, but those who may live and work in a rural community or in an urban community may experience more of that family flight issue than those of you who may live or work in a suburban community that maybe isn't experiencing families of young children leaving. But it is interesting that so that argument may work really well in a rural area that is really worried about not having any families with young children, or what we've seen in places like New York City, where that has actually been a very compelling message that Mayor-elect Mamdani used and others, this idea that families need to be able to stay in New York, and New York City is indeed losing huge swaths of families with children under the age of 5. So that's like one place we always think about how these arguments articulate most strongly in your own context. Um, I will tell you that personally, I found the public health and safety argument to land well with those who are not deeply engaged in childcare for what it's worth. This idea that police departments can't stay staffed or fire and medical services can't stay staffed without childcare. And so that, yeah, you can be, 85 years old and your children are all adults, your grandchildren are even not young children anymore. But you still really need that ambulance to show up when you have a fall, right? You need to show up in a timely manner, and you therefore need childcare. That can, I think, be something that can help people make that connection. It's interesting that I don't think people have as much trouble making the connection about the impact of schools on communities. I do think that they have some trouble making that connection of the impact of childcare on communities. So I want to hear from you about I just go talk this number 2 about number 4 here. So where do you see in your community childcare acting as social infrastructure? What are the ways in which childcare is strengthening your community, your own? If you work at a childcare program, that could be your own personal experience doing this work. If you work for a nonprofit or an advocacy group, just stories you've heard, like places you see it. But would love to hear. And again, you can either put that in the chat or you can raise your hand and we can have you come off. But would love to hear your stories of how childcare is strengthening your community.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Tessie. Reagan. I'm located in Rosamond, California, and I'm actually located next to a military base. So, and I'm prior military brat, and so childcare, especially family childcare, has a very special and deep meaning for me because that is exactly how we got ourselves embedded in communities. That's how we met in our neighbors. This is how we met people that could help us. This is how I met people when I moved to Germany who could watch my child because the military decided to deploy him like 10 days after we got to Germany. Like family child care for especially for military people, this is how we meet the people within our communities and we are able to make those connections. We are able to find out about services for our children. This is how we build out, like my entire program right now, 95% of them come from the base. They all know each other. So if somebody gets sick in my program, everybody's being sick because everybody was hanging out with each other during the weekend. That is how they built
Yeah.
their program, how they built their social network and their community and who was going to help them.
Thank you. That's a powerful example, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. And yeah, I think that connects right up to the security case, which we'll get to in a later book session too, right? This idea of you're also strengthening the military and national security, but that's a really powerful example. Others
Hey,
gonna rely on.
I just want to echo Tessie's point. I'm so glad to see so much uplifting of family childcare right now in the chat as well. But I wanted to echo that, I'm out in Texas. I serve a more rural area. But when I was in a more metropolitan area, Abilene, Texas, we had the Dice Air Force Base, who I served a lot of their overnight. So as a non-traditional childcare provider, I had about 12 children who would rotate, throughout the year when their parent would need to go in for those shifts at night, like to stock the bombs that we put at that Air Force base. And it was very grueling work. But as infrastructure, I was often a hub for family resources to be able to connect them to other mental health resources. Domestic violence was an issue that I confronted in my childcare home and had, a serious incident where I had to report, some challenging behavior, right? Not just what the child was going through, but what the family was going through. And as a mandated reporter, we are infrastructure to keeping children safe as well as keeping families together and making sure that the resources are available, not just to those who can afford it, is something that every community should be looking to stabilize their economy, but also to for that developmental approach. Families need to be able to grow roots somewhere. It's inherently important to be able to raise a child, but ultimately we need to be able to raise a village alongside of that. So I just really believe in childcare as a utility, as a public good. And in my experience as a national organizer, I have led strategies that continue to lean on childcare providers as hubs for civic engagement to be able to engage parents as they continue to not live single issue lives. Childcare is not the only issue that they're focused on. They're focused on housing and if they can afford their food and healthcare access. And often they're coming and they're like, "Hey, Miss BB, can I get a discount this month? We got to pay for so and so to go to the hospital, or we don't have enough food." And us as childcare providers, I know this, I've heard it so many times, we continue to be able to connect families to resources and continue to uphold our communities with that resourcing when it's not available statewide.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That resonates. This message in the chat from client. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I picked up my niece from childcare in early November. When families were not receiving a SNAP, the childcare was distributing fresh, culturally relevant produce for families on a Friday night for the weekend. That was vital food access support. What you're saying, what Tess is saying, all of this is, I think, getting at. This is part of why I'm glad to have this conversation, part where I read the book. Like those stories are not necessarily part of like the we need childcare so that parents can work and so that businesses can be productive case. It's not even necessarily part of the argument that we need good childcare so that children have high quality early childhood experiences. Though obviously these things we're talking about have tendrils into child development and into families being able to work. But it's so much more, right? Like people making friendships, people having access to vital resources, people being able to, get information, just directly get food to be able to feed themselves through the weekend. Like this is not the equivalent of like a gym, which is unfortunately so much how we treat childcare, right? Like this is a private market good and that's what we need it for. And so I think the more we can tell these stories, people don't understand it. I will say that's my experience that most of the public do not have young children, or who if they did have young children, they're older and they're a very different experience back, decades ago. They don't understand all these roles that childcare providers are playing. They don't understand how vital they are to communities. So I really appreciate all of that. And I think we need to say that, I think we need to make those cases very, very explicit so that people understand because there's just a knowledge gap. In a lot of cases, it's not malicious. It's just they don't, I've written about this on my Substack, but like also childcare is a very small footprint in like popular culture. Like we don't have an Abbott Elementary for for childcare. A lot of people just don't know what's going on. They don't have a sense of it. They don't have, and because it happens mostly when you're young, you don't even remember it. We all know what school is. We all know what a dentist's office is. Like we have experience with it. We don't all know what childcare is, particularly the diversity of childcare that we have in this country. That's really great. Thank you. So, like at the time, I want to switch us to talk to you about the family values case, which is a really interesting one to write, and a really interesting one to talk about. So, I'm going to pop in our last poll of the day, which just is going to ask you on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the least comfortable, 5 being the most comfortable. How comfortable are you at the moment making a family values case for childcare? Any other no right or wrong answers? This is anonymous, so just curious to get a pulse check. A family values case, I mean, making an argument that childcare is one way of strengthening families and strengthening their ability to essentially raise their kids the way they want to raise them, pass on values, traditions, you know, things like that. Great. So you can see here, and this is it's a mixture, right? We see no one sort of rating is super strong. I don't think some people are not very comfortable, some people in the middle, plenty of people are more comfortable. I will say when I've sort of started doing this work, I was probably more at like a 2, 3, and then I've become much more comfortable with it. Uh, I think there are a couple of reasons for it. That one is that we should name it, right? Family values, or the idea of centering the reproduction of values through the family, has been coded a certain way politically for about 50 years, right? And there it can be uncomfortable to talk about families in the same ways that it can be sometimes uncomfortable to talk about families with stay-at-home parents are not often part of our childcare conversations. It just is coded in a certain way. And it can also raise questions about what families are we talking about, which families are included when we talk about families. And obviously, that is also something that is very charged. But I do think I've tended to see childcare movement shy away from making family values-based arguments in favor of making arguments more about the kind of positive externalities through businesses, through the children themselves. Uh, but and this is something I think you all know, right? Like childcare does absolutely undergird strong families. And so anyone who cares, whatever their political persuasion, about the idea of families doing well, about the ideas of families being able to raise their kids the way they want to raise them and pass on their traditions and their values and engage in faith communities if that's what they want to do, engage in civic associations if that's what they want to do. All of those things really rely in a lot of ways on childcare. And I think we should be comfortable or get more comfortable saying that out loud because it can scramble the politics a little bit, right? It chases away that idea of, oh, these people want there to be childcare so that like the government can raise the kids. We know that's obviously a ridiculous argument, but it has landed in some ways. And one of the reasons I believe that it's landed is because there hasn't been a strong counterpunch saying, no, actually, strong families require the government and society to come alongside families to help them. But one of the legacies of the 70s that I talk about is that in both political parties really stopped talking about childcare in those terms and really just started talking about it as welfare that was sort of reluctantly offered to help lower income parents work. Right? We lost that sense of morality to it. We lost that sense of values to it. So here's a question for you then, similarly to kind of we asked about how you've seen childcare acting as social infrastructure. I'd be curious to hear any stories of like when have you seen childcare strengthen a family? I mean, we heard pieces of that before, right? Being able to feed, like being able to provide food, being able to provide friendships. But I think that being able to provide those examples of, look, this family would have been much worse off had they not had access to a childcare program, not from like a standpoint of being able to necessarily to work, but like this actually really helped them as a family unit to be more stable and to thrive in ways they wouldn't have without childcare. So I'm curious to hear if there are any stories anyone wants to share. You don't have to share names, obviously, but uh, when have you seen it strengthen a family? Janice said she support reunification for families. Yep. Childcare. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Any other stories you have from your own work? Wow. Yeah, it's a powerful. Katie says she knows of a family childcare provider who agreed to be the guardian of a child for a single father diagnosed with cancer and no other support. I mean, that's really when you start to like, yeah, again, this is not a simple service that like going to a restaurant or going to a gym. This is something that's much, much deeper. I see Maddie, your hands raised.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Someone who works at a childcare resource center shared with me that access to childcare was really instrumental for a family who had just moved from out of state into Michigan, and who didn't have any family or friends around. For that child to be able to like interact with other kids his age, and interact with, teachers who really cared about him. And, through that, she was able to get access to a play group and just, community, as other folks have shared. And, that really benefited her son with his social emotional development and just having community around.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing, Maddie. And again, that's such a good example of childcare as social infrastructure. Is not about a business being more productive. Which again, I don't mean to kick dirt on that argument. It's valid again, but like these are the things I want us to say more of because I think more people need to hear the stories. Okay, Britannia. So you have your hand up.
Okay. Sorry, I was trying to find the mute button. So back to your point about the elders in our village, I know several families who are in my rural community where, they were the caregivers for very young, rambunctious children. And unfortunately, the grandmother who was caring for a child who was, after he came to my program, was then, had some supports and families got him evaluated for autism. The grandmother, before coming to my program, the child, got out of the home and then the grandmother fell and she had, to go on hospice and all of these horrible situations like occurred. But I've seen access to child care be able to free the burden on our elders who have already contributed to society and are in their years where they're like, hey, I also need this care. A lot of rhetoric that we hear right now is where it's like, okay, grandma and auntie will take care of the baby, while working families are gone. But that isn't the case. And it also just dis it disses the profession of quality childcare, where people want to come and show up for their communities to be able to service them, but we're trying as a society to put that burden on women and especially the other mothers and grandmothers in the community. And I think that is something that we should push back on when we hear people saying like family values is staying home with your grandkids. You don't want to miss out. There are a lot of people, especially my rural community, who are living on their salaries, their fixed income, or relying on care from their adult children to be able to get by. And they also try to have their kiddos, grandkids come over, but it's very hard on them. Like it's a different level of work and activity that our elders should not be burdened with, especially without pay. I believe in family, friend, and neighbor care, and I'm part of a lot of other efforts to work on the vision bill that will value that unseen labor. But we should not see family values and strengthening childcare to be synonymous with pushing this burden of care onto our elders. And so I really would love to see more, and maybe I'll read this in the book, more parallels to how we can continue to support those types of arrangements and how to support intergenerational families who
Yeah.
choose to do life together.
That's a great point. I think that's right. I mean, to your point, I was just doing some work with the think tank I do. We're putting out a housing brief sometime in the next month or two talking about multi-generational housing. But a statistic I didn't know is that fully 1 million young children in this country have a grandparent as their primary guardian. And so we have 1 million grandparents. Like, that's a lot of young children who are rely on their grandparents as their primary guardians. So being able to provide that support. And you're right about this idea of, this is why I think we need to in some ways reclaim the family values work here, is that we should be able to support families in all of their diversity. And I make the argument in the book, and I've made it many other times, that like I think that includes those families that want to have a stay-at-home parent. I've taught, done plenty of work on that, and there are many parents, both moms and dads, who very sincerely would like to, that's what they want to do when their children are young, is be home with them. And that's often not a viable option because of economic pressures, because there's very little support available. And you can look at countries like Norway and Finland that offer home care stipends, right? They're like either, but it's not either or, right? It's both and. Like, we're going to make this comprehensive system where there's deeply subsidized to free external licensed childcare. And if you don't want that, then we're going to give you some support to stay home with your children when they're young and provide that care yourself. We've let ourselves, I think, sort of create this false dichotomy, and we've let ourselves this has been a very intentional effort, but it has been successful in many cases, pitting like so-called stay-at-home parents against so-called working parents, even though we also know those are very diverse groups, and they're very dynamic. They're often move in and out. There's very, very rarely clean. So I think that's right. One thing before I move to the next question, I just wanted to highlight this comment from Jordan about how there's support for families that are fleeing domestic violence situations, and so child care providers can truly be the difference between life and death. And again, like, we need to, that is stark and tragic, and also I think very compelling. Rafael, before I move forward, I saw that Karima has a comment in Spanish. Are you able to give a summary of that?
I'm going back right now to look for it. Probably I missed it. Let me try to find it.
No problem. I can recopy it here, or I can send it to you. I just don't want to miss that.
I got it.
Yeah.
So it's a comment saying like the providers empower families with resources for the community, information for them to keep studying, and other type of support, like with information about subsidies for families of low resources.
Yeah, that resource thing, that's come up by many of you, and I think that's really important. And there again, I quote in a later chapter, I think Mario Small is a sociologist, and he did this research in New York City and the child care centers, and he did find measurably, you could see the ways in which particularly low and moderate income parents were getting resources through their child care providers they would not otherwise have had, and it led to any number of positive things, from how do you do lead abatement in your house so that you make sure that your kids aren't exposed to toxic environmental chemicals, to networking that would help create a job, to creating, finding friends, which is an earlier point we talked about, who can essentially be like an emergency backup version of childcare, so that if you don't end up losing your job because you missed a shift because childcare isn't available and you don't have anyone that you trust with your child. So in any number of ways, I think that's right. I recognize we're starting to come up on time. This has been a great discussion, and I really appreciate everyone's high level of engagement, even on the wonderful virtual world. So I have one more question I want to dig to. We're gonna skip 6 for now, which is, so what's an action step you might take from these first three chapters. And what I mean by that is like thinking about these stories that we have started to share, thinking about the different cases that we've been talking about. Like for me, it might be like the next time I talk to child about childcare to a policymaker, I'm going to bring up this point about how childcare programs can help individuals fleeing domestic violence situations. Like that isn't a point that I have made before, and it is really, I think, a compelling one. And it's like I can bring that up. So that's what I mean when it's like an action step. Like say, like, oh, I either I'm going to talk about, I'll use this kind of a message, like this is a story I might share. I'm going to make sure that that I talk to my, city council person or legislator. Just what's one thing that you can do from these first three chapters that you think could add and be additive to your work? And go ahead and put that in the chat. Training multiple frames and communications. Yep. That's great. The entry point about family values and how that looks historically. Yeah. Great. What else? Any other thoughts? You might apply some of these messages. Oh, I didn't realize you were running for office, or if I did, I forgot. That's it's great, Britannia. Yeah, the community frame, the rural lawmakers. Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah, please, Kelly. Yeah, this is intended to be a service. Like I want this to be a resource for you all. So uh, please feel free. You have my permission to use this however you find useful in your work. Enjoyed making note about ton of fellow CCDF administrators, how we connect local advocates. This is great. The public safety angle. Yeah, I think that's because it can be a potentially powerful one. They're excellent. So what I want to know, I'll be curious to hear at our next session is how this goes. Like I'd be curious to hear as you start to apply these actions, how does it go? What do you learn? And then to see like what's working, what's not working. So we're running up against time here. I really appreciate all of you, first of all, taking an hour out of your day on the week before like the holidays to talk about it. I'm going to pass it over to Raphael, and I will say too, like we're going to want to hear from you about like what about this format works, what doesn't work, because we have a lot of flexibility to change this as we do the future sessions as well. So, Raphael.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you everyone for joining us in this first book club. You will hear from us soon because we are organizing, of course, our second one. We're gonna also try to gather some feedback from you on how this format is going to improve in the future for this and for other series that we're probably gonna have next year. So obviously, our second book club is gonna be for next year. We're still finalizing some dates. Elliot, we will need to communicate offline about this. But yeah, you will hear from us again for our second book club. And thank you so much. This has been like a great experience for us. And of course, as Elliot mentioned at the beginning, we're learning as we organize them, and we really appreciate your feedback, your questions, your interactions, and the energy you bring to this event. So thank you so much, everyone.
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you, and have a great day. Happy holidays for the ones that celebrate, and Happy New Year. And again, you will hear from us soon for our second book club. Thank you so much.
Thank you.